"You can't be here," the billionaire yelled, when he found the toddler standing inside the one room no one was ever allowed to enter. The little girl didn't cry. She didn't run away. She simply looked up at him with her dark, serious eyes, and held out a drawing she had made with her small hands. In that moment, something that had been locked inside the man for 3 long years began to move. The Crosshaven estate stood on a jagged cliff above the Pacific in Big Sur, where the wind never stopped, and the glass walls made the ocean feel like it was breathing right against the house. It was a place built for silence and distance, sharp edges, cold stone floors, and views that went on forever, but never let anyone get too close. Damian Cross had designed it that way. After his wife died, he wanted the house to match the way he felt inside, open to the sky, but closed to everything else. Lila Rivera had come to this estate 8 months ago with her daughter Sophia, who everyone simply called Sofi. Lila was 27 years old and had already learned what it meant to lose everything that mattered. Her husband had been killed in a sudden flash flood while working on a road crew back in their small town in New Mexico. One moment he was there, the next he was gone, and Lila was left alone with a 2-year-old and no family to lean on. She had packed what little they owned into an old car and driven west because this was the only job that let her keep her daughter with her. The live-in housekeeper position at Crosshaven came with a small cottage on the edge of the property, steady pay, and one important rule: stay out of the main house unless you were called, and never let the child wander where she did not belong. Sophie was 2 years and 10 months old, small for her age, with big dark eyes that seemed to notice everything. She carried her stuffed bear, Mr. Buttons, with her everywhere she went. She did not speak many words yet, but she had her own language. From the time she could walk, Sophie had loved making things neat and balanced. Every morning she lined up her crayons on the little table in the cottage, in perfect rainbow order, from red to purple, never mixing them. When they walked along the cliff path, she would stop to pick up stones and arrange them in careful lines or circles on the ground. She grouped fallen leaves by size and color. She placed shells she found near the water in neat rows. It was never just play. There was always a pattern, something inside her that needed the scattered pieces of the world to sit together in a way that made sense. Damian Cross was 41 and carried the kind of stillness that came from years of holding pain in a tight fist. He had built his clean energy company from nothing after Amara's death 3 years earlier. The accident had happened on the coastal highway during a storm almost exactly like the ones that still rolled in off the ocean. They had been trying for a baby. The house had been meant to hold laughter and small feet running across the floors. Instead, Damian had locked the entire East Wing the week after the funeral and told everyone it was off limits forever. That wing held Amara's art studio, her favorite sunroom with the best view of the water, her shelves of sketchbooks, and the reading chair where she used to sit for hours. No one cleaned it. No one entered it. Not even the head gardener was allowed near the glass doors that opened onto the small private terrace she had loved. Victoria Lang had been in Damian's life for almost a year and engaged for 7 months. She was 30, elegant, and very good at getting what she wanted without ever raising her voice. She came from a family that had once had money and now had connections instead. She saw Crosshaven as the perfect stage for the life she had planned. Important dinners, magazine features, the kind of parties where people talked about power and influence. She had been patient with Damian's grief at first, but patience was not her strongest quality. Over the past few months, she had started making gentle suggestions that the East Wing should finally be opened. It was time to let light back into the house. It was time to stop living like a museum. Damian listened to her the way he listened to most things, with quiet attention and no clear answer. Lila learned quickly how to move through the big house without being noticed. She cleaned the glass until it disappeared, polished the stone floors until they shone, and made sure fresh flowers were always in the main rooms, even though no one ever commented on them. She kept Sophie in the cottage during the day, where the little girl played with her crayons and stones, and Mr. Buttons. But Sofi was curious. She loved watching the big glass walls catch the changing light. Sometimes when Lila was working, she would let Sofi sit on a blanket in a corner of the main living room with strict instructions to stay there. The little girl would sit quietly for a while, then her hands would start moving, grouping the edges of the blanket into straight lines, or placing her crayons in perfect order on the floor beside her. Damian began to notice small changes around the house, without realizing it at first. One morning he walked through the main hallway and saw a single smooth stone sitting on the wide windowsill. It had not been there the day before. A few days later, he found 3 small shells, arranged in a triangle, on the low table near the big glass doors that faced the ocean. He asked the head housekeeper about it. She said she had not put them there. When he asked Lila, she apologized immediately and promised it would not happen again. Damian told her it was fine and walked away. But later that evening, he found himself standing in front of the 3 shells, turning them slowly with one finger. Victoria noticed the small arrangements too, and she did not like them. She began making more requests of Lila, extra polishing in the evenings, rearranging furniture for upcoming dinners, tasks that kept her moving between the main house and the cottage at odd hours. One afternoon, she stopped Lila in the hallway and said with a pleasant smile that children could be so unpredictable, and that perhaps it would be better if Sofi stayed inside the cottage during the day from now on. We wouldn't want her getting into any trouble in a house this size, she said. Lila nodded and said she understood. The storm came on a Tuesday afternoon in late spring. The wind had been building all morning, pushing against the glass walls until the whole house seemed to hum. Lila was in the main living room, wiping down the long table, when she realized Sofi was no longer on her blanket in the corner. The little girl had been quiet all morning, drawing on a piece of paper with her blue crayon. Lila stepped into the hallway and felt her chest tighten. At the far end, the door to the east wing stood open. A strong gust must have pushed it when one of the workers had carried equipment through earlier in the day. The lock had not caught. Lila ran down the hallway. She reached the doorway and stopped. Sofi was inside the forbidden sunroom, standing on her tiptoes beside Amara's old art table. Mr. Buttons was tucked under one arm. With her free hand, the little girl was carefully taking colored pencils from an old tin and placing them in a perfect arc across the dusty surface. She had found a single white feather on the floor near the glass doors and had set it gently in the very center of the arc, like a finishing touch. The room smelled of salt and old paper and the sea wind that was now pushing through the slightly open terrace door. Damian had been in his study at the other end of the house. He heard movement where there should have been only silence. He came fast, his shoes sharp against the stone. When he stepped through the open doorway and saw the small figure standing in the one place he had forbidden everyone from entering, the years of locked grief rose up in him like a wave. "You can't be here." His voice cracked across the room, louder and rougher than he had ever spoken to anyone in the house. It carried the sound of every door he had closed, and every night he had sat alone in the dark. Sofi turned slowly. She did not look scared. She looked at him with those serious dark eyes, then reached into the little cloth bag she always carried, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She held it out to him with both small hands. Damian stared at the paper for a long moment before taking it. It was a drawing Sofi had made that morning in the cottage. The lines were careful, and the colors chosen with thought. She had drawn the big glass house, sitting on the cliff, with the ocean below in steady blue waves. Inside one of the rooms, she had drawn a figure, standing by the window. Outside, on the path, she had drawn another, taller figure. Between them floated a small red heart. At the bottom, in uneven toddler letters, she had asked Lila to help her write, were 3 words, "All better now." Lila reached the doorway out of breath, her face pale. "Mr. Cross, I'm so sorry. She must have slipped away while I was working. I'll take her out right now. It won't happen again." Damian did not answer immediately. He was still looking at the drawing. When he finally spoke, His voice was quieter. She was putting the pencils in order, like they were supposed to be together. He folded the paper carefully and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket. Then he did something no one at Crosshaven had ever seen him do. He lowered himself until he was at Sophie's eye level. The little girl watched him without moving. After a long moment, he reached out and very gently straightened the white feather she had placed in the center of her pencil arc. "You can go," he said to Lila, but there was no anger left in the words. "It's all right this time." Victoria heard about the incident before the sun went down. She had her ways of knowing everything that happened inside the walls. At dinner that evening, she brought it up with her usual light, concerned tone. "I understand there was a small situation today," she said, cutting her salmon with precise movements. "The child in the East Wing. I can only imagine how difficult that must have been for you, Damian. Perhaps we should finally have a clear conversation about boundaries. Some spaces are simply not meant for little feet, no matter how innocent the intention." Damian kept eating without looking up. She didn't touch anything that belonged to Amara. She was arranging pencils. "Still," Victoria said, her voice staying pleasant, "we have important people coming for dinner next week. I would hate for there to be any awkwardness or questions about why a child is wandering through private areas of the house. It gives the wrong impression." Damian finished his meal in silence. Later that night, long after Victoria had gone to her own wing of the house, he sat in his study and took Sophie's drawing from his pocket. He unfolded it under the desk lamp and ran one finger along the careful lines of the house and the two figures with the heart between them. Outside, the wind pressed against the glass, and the ocean kept its steady, endless sound. In the days that followed, more small arrangements began appearing in the main parts of the house. A line of 5 smooth stones appeared on the wide windowsill in the living room, placed from smallest to largest. A single flower from the garden, its stem carefully broken to the right length, showed up in a clean glass on the kitchen counter. The old wilted bouquet that had been sitting in the hallway for days suddenly looked fresh. Again, the stems trimmed and grouped, so the colors balanced, instead of fighting each other. The staff noticed, but said nothing. One of the gardeners told Lila quietly that the little girl had been seen early one morning, placing pine needles in a perfect star shape near the front steps. Lila apologized and promised to watch her more closely. But the gardener shook his head and said the star had looked nice, like someone had taken time to make the ground look cared for. Damian found himself pausing more often in the hallways. He would stop in front of the new line of stones, or the balanced flowers, and stand there for a minute or two before continuing to his study. One afternoon, he walked into the sunroom and found Sophie there again. She was placing 3 small shells she must have carried from the beach path, in a careful triangle, on Amara's old reading chair. When she saw him, she did not look guilty. She simply pointed at the shells and said one clear word: "Safe." He sat down in the chair beside the triangle and watched her work. After a while, he asked, "Do you like being in here?" Sophie nodded. She placed one more shell to finish the shape, then walked over and leaned her small body against his leg for a moment, before going back to her task. It was the first time in 3 years anyone had touched him inside that room without it feeling like pity. Victoria's patience was wearing thin. She began making more direct comments about how the house needed to feel ready for the next chapter of Damian's life. She talked about redecorating the sunroom, about hosting larger events, about how some memories were beautiful but could not be allowed to keep the present from moving forward. Damian listened the same way he always did, with quiet attention and no promise. The investor dinner was scheduled for a Friday evening. Victoria had planned it for weeks. The long table in the main dining room was set with imported flowers, crystal glasses, and low candles, so the ocean view would be the real centerpiece. She had given Lila clear instructions 2 days earlier. Sophie was to stay in the cottage for the entire evening, no exceptions. The child's presence would only create questions among people who expected a certain level of polish and order. Lila had agreed. She bathed Sophie early, read her 3 stories, and tucked her into bed in the cottage with Mr. Buttons and a small stack of board books. Then she put on her uniform and walked to the main house to help serve. Halfway through the first course, one of the guests at the far end of the table leaned forward and asked who had arranged the flowers. The elaborate centerpiece that had been professionally done that afternoon was no longer the same. Someone had quietly moved several stems, added a few small, smooth stones around the base, and shifted one of the candles, so the whole display now had a balanced, living symmetry that made the rest of the table feel more alive. Victoria's smile stayed in place, but her eyes moved down the length of the table. At the very end, standing on a chair she had pulled over, was Sofi, in her soft blue pajamas, carefully adjusting one last stem with both hands. She had slipped out of the cottage when the wind picked up again, walked the path in her bare feet, and come straight to the dining room because she had seen the flowers earlier in the day, and thought they looked lonely on one side. Damian saw her. At the same moment the guest spoke. He stood up without a word, walked the full length of the table, and lifted Sofi down from the chair. He did not hand her to Lila with an apology. He carried her back to his seat at the head of the table, sat down with her on his lap, and continued his conversation with the investor beside him, as if having a small child in pajamas at a formal dinner was the most ordinary thing in the world. The table stayed quiet for a few seconds. Then the conversation resumed, softer, with more glances toward the head of the table, where the little girl sat quietly, watching the candlelight, with her serious dark eyes. After the last guest had left, and the candles had been blown out, Victoria found Damian in the sunroom. Sofi had fallen asleep on the couch with Mr. Buttons still under her arm. Lila stood nearby, unsure if she should stay or go. Victoria's voice had lost its pleasant edge. "This cannot continue, Damian." The child was in the dining room, in front of everyone important. She touched the arrangements. She was in her pajamas. People were already asking questions before they even left. "I have worked too hard on this evening to let it become some kind of story about a toddler running loose in a house that is supposed to represent control and vision." Damian looked at her for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but carried a finality that had not been there before. "You're right," he said. "It is becoming a story, the kind where a little girl, who has already lost more than most adults ever will, still finds ways to make broken things look whole again. And the kind where a man who thought he wanted the house to stay empty finally understands it was never supposed to be a museum of grief." He glanced at Sofi, sleeping on the couch, then at Lila, who had not moved from her place near the door. "I think you should go, Victoria. Pack what you need tonight. I'll have the car ready whenever you are." Victoria stared at him. For the first time since she had arrived at Crosshaven, she had no smooth reply ready. She turned and left the room without another word. In the weeks that followed, the house began to open in ways no one had expected. The door to the east wing stayed unlocked. Sofi continued her quiet work of arranging, sometimes alone, sometimes with Damian sitting nearby, watching her place stones or pencils, or the new set of colored shells he had asked the gardener to bring from the beach. Lila found herself in the sunroom more often in the evenings, not because she was working, but because Sofi would take her hand and lead her there, and Damian would already be sitting in Amara's old reading chair, with a book he was not really reading. One clear morning, with the ocean calm below the cliff, Sofi led both of them into the sunroom. She had spent the early hours arranging 3 larger stones she had found near the path. She placed them in a careful triangle on the low table. In the center, she put a single white flower from the garden. Then, she took Damian's hand in one of her small ones, and Lila's hand in the other, and brought them together above the triangle. She looked up at both of them with her serious, dark eyes, and said the clearest sentence she had, spoken in weeks. "All better now." Damian looked at the small arrangement, then at the woman standing beside him, then at the child who had walked into the locked part of his life, and started putting the pieces into a pattern he had not known he was missing. The wind moved gently through the open glass doors. The ocean kept its steady rhythm far below. For the first time in 3 years, the house did not feel like it was holding its breath, waiting for something that would never come back. Lila felt his hand tighten gently around hers. She did not pull away. Sofi leaned against both of them. Mr. Buttons still tucked under one arm, and watched the flower in the center of her triangle move, slightly in the breeze without falling. The stones held it steady. Outside, the morning light caught on the glass walls of Cross Haven and turned the whole cliffside bright and alive. Inside the sunroom, 3 people stood together in a space that had once been closed to everyone, and nothing felt forbidden anymore. The wind kept moving, the ocean kept speaking, and the small arrangements Sofi left behind continued to appear in quiet corners of the house. Lines of stones, balanced flowers, careful circles that made scattered things look like they had always belonged together. Damian began leaving the sunroom door open, even on colder days. Lila started keeping an extra sweater on the back of Amara's old chair. Sofi kept drawing her careful pictures and placing her stones in patterns that somehow made the big glass house feel smaller and warmer at the same time. The 3 of them did not talk much about what had changed. They simply let the days unfold, one balanced arrangement at a time, until the locked wing no longer felt like a shrine, and the house no longer felt like it was waiting for permission to live again. And every evening, when the light turned gold on the water and the wind softened against the glass, Sofi would lead them both into the sunroom, point at her latest triangle of stones or line of shells, and say with quiet satisfaction the same 2 words that had started everything shifting in the first place: all better. Part